welcome everyone. Welcome everyone in the room, and to those of you online attending, I can see from several continents. We are Happy Hallows Day. So now we had Hallows Eve last night. Sorry, I have to say that it's not All Souls Day, the best day of the year. But anyway, welcome to everyone in the room and online. I'm very happy to welcome Jason Nguyen from the University of Toronto, who's traveling to Cambridge from Paris to be with us to share his research. Jason, you are an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in the Daniels faculty and an expert on 17th century and 18th century French architecture. You've worked on, but it's interesting, you've come into architecture from working from history of science, from cartography, objects, materiality, but now you're looking at this realm of landscape, land ownership, and real estate development. So you're looking from different spheres of architecture. So you're going to share that with us today in your paper, Crafting Contracts, Architects, Solicitors, Notaries, and the Architecture of Commemoration in 17th century France. So please welcome Jason.
Thank you. You can hear me. Everything's good. Okay. Thank you so much to everyone for the invitation. Thank you, Elizabeth, for helping the coordination, et cetera, et cetera. I did my graduate work in the other Cambridge, and this one's nicer. I had never been here before, so it was a real treat arriving yesterday morning. So here we go. Here we go. Actually, or do I press a?
You can press this one if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, dear. Okay. In many instances, the architect doubled as the contractor, a position that came with tangible aims and billable rates, things like building execution, materials, and so on. During the 17th century, architects sought to distinguish themselves from the contractors and craftspeople that constituted the labor force. In Paris, the establishment of the Royal Academy of Architecture in 1671 provided an institutional framework to develop a theoretical program and eventually provide vocational instruction for the king's architects. Regulations passed in 1676, 1717, 1735, and 1775 forbade them from pursuing contracting and real estate speculation, which aimed to ensure the quality of royal edifices by eliminating pecuniary interests. These efforts illustrate the state's efforts to elevate architecture, quote unquote, above the mechanical practices rooted in manual labor and commerce. As a case study, the opposition presents a unique instance for which an architect requested professional compensation based on his creative work, divorced from construction and the structures of legal documentation that adjoined it. The architectural historian Claude Mignon noted the difficulty in assessing the relationship between architects and their patrons in early modern France, given the paucity of written evidence relating to the stages and processes of artistic invention. The documents that do exist often show the patron claiming credit for the project's magnificence, and this relates to a theoretical concept called convenance, which align the patron's social rank with the appropriate degree of embellishment. Remarkably, Boulez, the architect we're talking about here, his treatise, shown on the screen, the Architecture Pratique, published in 1691, announced the field's increasing commercialization. The book provided detailed instructions for the toisé, which was the technique of measuring and building to draft work orders, manage labor, and conduct cost estimates. And these documents would be signed by all relevant parties, notarized and filed with the city. In addition to these instructions, it included a specifications template to help his readers draw up expedient agreements. These efforts attempted to streamline architectural practice according to the norms and customs of the municipal judiciary, aligning the field not only with elite patrons, but also with the city government. This move reinforced the architect's function as a coordinator of labor and arbiter of taste in an increasingly commercial society. That Boulez's study of architectural contracts unfolded alongside the contemporaneous debates on social contract and customs by the likes of John Locke and Montesquieu, among others, illustrates the period's broader concerns for legal order and the structures of modern governance. Most importantly, the case study shows an instance for which an architect sought to define the trade and compensable labor of creativity in the eyes of the law. So I'm really kind of interested in this case and just the issues that it seems to raise and how an architect is defining his own roles and responsibilities at a moment when the profession is really coming into its being in a very specific way. So this research forms a part of my current book project, which is titled Bodies of Expertise, which charts the professionalization of the architectural trade during the 17th and 18th centuries in Paris. During this period, state and municipal authorities built an expansive bureaucracy to regulate, or at least attempt to regulate, architectural practice and theoretical discourse. Louis XIV established the Royal Academy of Architecture in 1671 to train architects in the taste and technologies of the period, as well as institutions that oversee construction on the private market. Here on the left-hand side being Claude Perrault's translation of Vitruvius from 1671, which served as a kind of foundational document, image also celebrating the buildings being constructed at the time in France. A newly formed corps of experts, the advertisement of which is here on the left, composed of architects and contractors, acted as the state's intermediary to reinforce regulations across the building trades. Architects like Pierre Boulez, Augustin Chaldevier, and Antoine Dégodet theorized technical practices which streamline the architect's expertise according to the legal customs and commercial realities of an emergent nation state and its imperial economy. Until the end of the 17th century, the term architect was more of a social than a vocational designation. Most self-styled architects trained in craft practices like masonry or carpentry before claiming expertise in the design of buildings. And unlike in Italy, architecture in France was distinct from its so-called sister arts of painting and sculpture, vocationally at the very least. The primary difference between an architect and a mason or a contractor concerned patronage and funding. The former, an architects, traditionally worked in the service and under the protection of the elite, kings, princes, and other nobles, hence their elevated social position, while the latter speculatively constructed buildings on the real estate market. The La Maison catalog of costumes shown here on the screen, which collapse the instruments of one's trade into the human form, illustrates the intersection of rank, the body, and dress in period representations of labor. The Stoic form of the architect, adorned by the elements of classical design, contrasts with the activated physique of the mason. The former stands upright in a garden, suggesting his elevated standing, and carries a measuring rod, a T-square, and a floor plan. Meanwhile, the latter strolls amid a rocky terrain, a reference to the materials of his work, in an outfit composed of the tools used to pry, shovel, and chisel stone. A strategically hanging pickaxe dangling from the mason's waist highlights the sexual undertones that frequently adjoin to visual commentaries on labor and commercial life. The book, my book, not the book that this comes from, assesses why, how, and to what consequence architects sought the professional expertise to enter and regulate all facets of construction for an expanding civil and commercial society. Central, yet often overlooked in the architectural scholarship, are some of the economic conditions that spurred many of the state's reforms. The pursuit of glory incited Louis XIV's initial desire to standardize architectural practice. Imperial overstretch stemming from military spending, colonization efforts, and in the expansions of Versailles strained French finances, which foreclosed the state's ability to sponsor expensive architectural projects from the 1690s onward. Investments in colonial markets helped stimulate private development, which prompted many royally affiliated architects, Boulez among others, to undertake speculative projects on the real estate market. Their entrepreneurial exploits fostered the dissemination of the Rococo decorative style, illustrated by the commercial prints and scientific manuals here on the screen. The codification of architectural expertise thus stands as a specifically modern form of regulation that unfolded alongside the erosion of centralized stylistic authority and the maturation of commercial society. So this feels very technical, but just FYI, here's the organization of the project, because I've been thinking about it a lot lately. The project studies 5 areas of practice that underwent regulation and normalization at the hand of theory and practice, those being labor, customs, which is what they would have called the law, the civil code, contracts, materials, and costs. So today I'll be talking a little bit about that one right in the center, which is contracts. And it diagnoses the period's artistic experiments, interior design, and decoration as part of a broader commercializing force in architectural and artisanal practice, one influenced in many ways by the globalization and imperialization of political economies in early modern Europe. Ultimately, the project argues that the streamlining of expertise contributed to a profound reframing of the architect as a civil as well as commercial figure at the dawn of the modern age. Now, to talk a bit more about this case study, so during the 17th century, the construction of ecclesiastical buildings relied on the generosity of private figures who served as the client by contracting their own architects and craftspeople. At the Filles de la Croix, the mausoleum, which we showed earlier, offered the abbot the opportunity to support the church while also memorializing his father and family into posterity. Claude Mignot, the historian I mentioned earlier, notes that ecclesiastical projects counted among the rare works during the 17th century that left traces of the architect-patron relationship, given the range of actors involved, priests, abbesses, benefactors, etc. During this period, royally affiliated architects eagerly sought private commissions, given economic slowdowns happening during the 1690s that halted construction at the Bâtiment du Roi, which were the state building works. Boulez, like many of his contemporaries, worked almost exclusively for non-government clients from the 1680s onward. For architects, ecclesiastical commissions provided architects with high visibility projects, often funded by private benefactors eager to signal their religious commitments during a period of limited royal work. In Paris, the 17th century, the same period witnessed a building boom in ecclesiastical architecture, even though it's often overlooked. The Edict of Nantes, signed into law into 1598, brought an end to the wars of religion of the 16th century and inaugurated a period of religious peace conducive to church construction. Newly formed congregations served the capital's expanding population, which doubled from about 300,000 to 600,000 inhabitants during the period, while also responding to the directives of the Council of Trent, which called for the relocation of female orders from the countryside to the cities to offer public charity. On the map, which I find super interesting, which kind of does relate to the larger project, that is some of the real estate aspects. So on the map, the amber orange blocks show the extents of the 17th century development. The property gained by the church during this period dwarfed that of the Renaissance, shown in deep orange, and the 18th century, shown in yellow. So the church was actually some of the largest property owners and developed this property for rental properties during the 17th and 18th centuries. The Abbé Defia, who carried his title not by religious training, but for his financial support of the church, had long desired a suitable site to preserve the remains of his father, the nobleman and military diplomat, Antoine Coiffier de Couzet, the Maréchal Defia. The Filles de la Croix, or the Sisters of the Cross, owed its establishment to the sponsorship of new convents, as well as the patronage of wealthy benefactors. The order developed out of the rapidly expanding Dominican convent of the Sisters of St. Thomas Aquinas. In 1637, the abbot's sister joined the order, bequeathing it the entirety of her fortune. And with these funds, the women purchased a property in the eastern suburb of Saint-Antoine, where they commissioned the building of a small but well-decorated chapel, nunnery, and garden. The complex included an entry court for the loading and unloading of goods and a private cloisters for the sisters' worship and dwelling. I just want to point out I'm sorry, they're located right over here. So near Bastille for people who know Paris, actually, so in the eastern suburb there. So this is the Rue de Charonne, actually, which is shown here. With their convent being right here. The church actually, or the convent no longer exists. It was demolished in the early 20th century. But here is an image of the chapel and the living quarters above. The explosion in new construction spurred a series of stylistic developments, stylistic changes in ecclesiastical architecture. On the exterior, builders gradually adopted the Roman-style facade, echoing the model proposed to the court of Francis I by the Italian architect Sebastiano Serlio. The model included a double order of pilasters, which accommodated a vaulted nave and side chapels on the interior. And the style crossed often contested congregational lines, noting that the novitiate of the Jesuits, shown on the right, served as an inspiration for the Jansenist chapel at the Port Royal. The architect Pierre Boulez worked in the service of the state, private, and ecclesiastical patrons during his career. He was born into a family of master masons, and he gained initial prominence in public works like the Porte Saint-Martin, Triumphal Arch, which is still in Paris, with his mentor François Blondel, and the publication of the Plan de Paris, this kind of large map of Paris, which is also commissioned by the king. In his practice, he designed residences for the Parisian elite, a handful of seigneurial chateaux, urban mansions for members of the aristocracy and royal administration, and 2 townhouses at the Place Vendôme, shown here on the bottom, a project for which he was an investor and speculator. Among his church properties, he designed chapels for Saint-Germain-des-Prés, the Visitation Convent of Saint-Marie de Chaillot, which is shown here on the upper right, and the Dominican Novitiate of the Jacobins. He counted among the ranks of the Royal Academy of Architecture, participating in topics on construction, building science, and the civil code called the Coutume de Paris. Boulez's work at the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, for instance, highlights the interdependence of architecture and sculpture in ecclesiastical projects. There, he contracted the sculptor Laurent Megnier to realize the chapels of Saint Marguerite and Saint Casimir, located in the church's northern and southern transepts. So this is the church, and so it's in this transept and this transept. In 1679, the pair completed the chapel of Saint Marguerite, illustrated in the drawing on the left. Depicted as a shepherdess, the saint stands contrapposto atop a dragon and a concave niche. Boulez framed the altar with a pair of twin freestanding Corinthian columns that supported a rounded pediment, which he crowned with a cross, two reclining angels, and flaming trophies. The receipts for this project actually shed light a little bit on the project's pay structure and schedule, just to get a sense of how people got paid and when. So in April of 1682, the marble supplier provided a work order, which all parties signed and filed with the authorities. Work unfolded during the course of that summer and autumn of that same year. And in December, the abbey paid Boulez around £2,000, which presumably covered design, materials, and execution of each chapel. The sculptor also paid that same month in December of 1682, so after construction was already completed, received about £600, or about 1/3 the architect's fees, and the marble supplier received £1,000, or about half the architect's fees, and he received this actually the next month, so the very last. The documents themselves do not list a separate contractor, which suggests that Boulez managed labor and quality control himself, which was not atypical. Boulez's engagement with the Dominican order dated to 1681, when it hired him to develop the terrain of their novitiate on the left bank. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the church counted among the largest landowners in the city and derived most of its revenue from real estate. Seeing the pace of elite development in its quarter, the order commissioned Boulez to redesign the church and convent, which is now the Church of St. Thomas Aquinas. It now is part of the campus of Sciences Po, for those, again, who might know Paris, surrounded by 27 homes, each of which carried an average rent of around £3,000. These are quite elite. This is about £3,000 is about 4 times the amount of an annual income of an average laborer. So you can see this is the church, and then there were, this map doesn't quite show it, but there were 27, is that the number I said? Like grand kind of mansions that surrounded this, and these would have been rented out to rather wealthy inhabitants, which again was not super atypical that a wealthy person would rent their home as opposed to own it outright. Wealthy benefactors and ecclesiastical institutions helped to support the building industries during the turbulent last decades of the 17th century. By the late 1680s, Louis XIV's unsustainable military spending and successive expansions at Versailles had strained French finances and weakened the domestic economy. To fund the 9 Years' War, which went from 1688 to 1697, the crown had actually slashed the funding at the Bâtiment du Roi, or the state building works, by about 87%. From about £15 million in 1685, which is the height of Versailles' construction, to a paltry £1.9 million in 1691, just 6 years later, a level at which it remained through the early 18th century. So at the Fille de la Croix, the mausoleum allowed Boulez to gain a wealthy and well-connected client, while also continuing his affiliations with the real estate-rich Dominican sisterhood. The abbot commissioned the tomb to honor the memory of his father, shown here on the left, Antoine Coiffier de Rouzet, the Marquis d'Effiat, and the former Maréchal de France. The design proposed, it's like is rather interesting, but we don't need to go into that. It's like tied up with Three Musketeers drama and such. Sounds kind of interesting. The design proposed a double-height centralized structure in masonry that framed the funerary monument. Niches in the 4 corners provided sites for religious or allegorical statuary. It kind of evokes like the elevation, but you imagine the plan kind of revokes that kind of church I showed earlier that's kind of centralized. A wrought iron balustrade breaks down the scale of the room while also providing an opportunity for decorative embellishment. Given the lack of experience in funerary architecture, Boulez possibly secured the project through his existing relationship with the Dominican order. For the sepulchre, for the tomb itself, or the sculpture, he sought the expertise of Philippe Megnier, an artist in the king's services at Versailles, a member of the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, and the son of Laurent, the sculptor from Saint-Germain-des-Prés. In the project, the younger Megnier honored the dead with a pyramidal monument that supported a portrait in relief, a cherub in marble or bronze, the family crest, and other commemorative ornaments. The monument anchored the room, providing an enduring symbol of the Effiat patronage of the convent. The project offered the architect and sculptor a prestigious new client, both the abbot and the Dominican order, during a period of limited construction at the state works. Now, Desmonville, that solicitor we kind of started with, he pointed to Boulet's drawings and Magnier's models as evidence of the quality and quantity of work that was completed. For architects, drawings played two important roles. First, they functioned as the locus of design, and second, they helped to establish the labor hierarchy, given that the authority to make drawings signals one's standing as a coordinator of work, materials, and costs. As outlined in their opposition, Boulet transmitted drawings to Megnier, who then used them as the basis for his tomb. And the sculptor made study models at different scales to conceptualize the project's three-dimensional qualities, an important act given the period's taste for ornate curvilinear forms. This is kind of the early germination of the Rococo era, stylistically. So as representational tools, drawings and models functioned as documents to signal authority, convey information, and establish professional relationships. In France, drawing only developed into a professional and formalized practice during the second half of the 17th century. Prior to this point, figures in building industries employed graphic forms of representation for several undefined purposes. Craftsmen drew them to instruct on construction. Sculptors, decorators, and some architects actually used them to kind of express the character of a project. Elizabeth and I were talking about François Mansart yesterday. I suppose he would be in that kind of second category. The personal reign of Louis XIV, which spanned from 1661 to 1715, inaugurated a period of large-scale construction, which required the collaboration and coordination of different workers. French military and industrial developments during the 1670s and 1680s prompted the building of palaces and monuments. Again, this is for you, Elizabeth. I did not have this in my image thing as of last night, but I put it in for you. Whose construction provided a constant stream of work for architects, decorators, and craftspeople at the state building works. So on the right here is the construction of the Louvre. And on the left-hand side here is the construction of the Invalides, which was like a hospital used to kind of for returning military veterans. And so the drawing is kind of shown as a form of authority being pointed out by the king, suggesting he himself was taking ownership of the design. The Royal Academy of Architecture, established in 1671, placed design within the more theoretical framework, or the theoretical framework of the liberal arts, kind of rehearsing a common kind of liberal or mechanical arts opposition. There, drawings helped architects conceptualize theoretical doctrine, highlighting a plan and elevation of the Ionic order that Boulet himself actually composed for the institution. He did this actually prior to even joining the institution. On the left, he included freehand drawn acanthus leaves, among other ornaments, and used horizontal and diagonal hatching to express the curvature of the fluting and volutes. On the right, he labeled the document plan of the Ionic capital of Scamozzi in reference to the Italian master whose treatise consumed several academic discussions during the 1670s, and these drawings are dated to them. These drawings actually helped to establish the principles and standards of theoretical doctrine for the literal and figurative building of the state during the reign of Louis XIV. For the abbot's estate, Boulet requested compensation for the design, drawings, and management of the mausoleum project. On December 5th, so 1 month after the sculptor and Desmonville, the solicitor, appeared to contest the inventory, so 1 month later, Desmonville returned to the Arsenal to advocate for the architect, for whom he sought compensation for, these are really fun to read, by the way, the drawings that were needed for the, I show it here in French and also in English, the drawings that were needed for the mausoleum of Monsieur Maréchal de Fiat, 3 drawings for the choir of the church at the Ville de la Croix that he made at his own cost, 2 drawings for the entry gate of the convent, several trips for the management and receipt of work changes and repairs that had been made at his home at the Arsenal over the years. For all the above, the aforementioned Sir F. Boulet requests to be paid in full with interest, fees, and expenses. Now, drawings played an important role in resolving legal conflicts, especially with the formalization of the building review process during the late 17th and 18th centuries. And I showed earlier, I'm not going to go into it here, but that kind of core of experts. Now, the legal historian, Robert Calvet, notes that drawings were used for 3 primary purposes in matters of conflict resolution, of which this would be one of them, as documents produced by construction experts called to review the site of conflict. So say, 2 neighbors are arguing over their property, someone might come and kind of make a survey, and that serves as a kind of a document that would be reviewed by a judge or someone in a judicial post. as forms of evidence between opposing parties to establish fault in matters of poor design versus poor construction, for instance. So say a building that's under construction starts to fall down, is it the contractor's fault or the architect's? So one might take recourse to the drawings that were produced for that project. And as documents made to resolve conflicts, so drawings outlining proposed repairs. Say a building is falling apart, and so a drawing made to kind of resolve that issue by kind of proposing how it would be repaired. In this case, Desmontville's characterized Boulet's drawing as a form of testimony, so somewhere in that second category, suggesting that they functioned as generators of design, instructions for labor management, and importantly, proof to claim payment. For a patron, an architect might compose a presentation drawing to establish design concept and the decorative program. For a craftsperson, that same professional might make an outline drawing to convey dimensional information, such as the one filed under the School of Charles Lebrun in the collection of the Louvre. The document, composed in black pencil, pen, and ink on paper, depicts a centralized and double height space whose form is evocative of the mausoleum interior, but of course devoid of the ornament. The inclusion of the scale along the base suggests a practical intention related to measurement and proportion. Drawings such as this would have buttressed Boulet's legal claims regarding the level and sophistication of the work completed. The legal opposition offers insight on the scale and scope of the work at the convent. In 1678, so a while ago, the Swedish architectural historian Runar Strandberg speculated that the mausoleum was likely to be an annex of the existing chapel, which you show here the picture of on the bottom right, and this is the complex, so it would probably actually come out into the garden. It would be an annex of the existing chapel, given Boulet's drawing of the existing choir, which we no longer have, but he surmised, but Strandberg surmised that one likely accessed the tomb via the choir, which you see in the image here, so off of this building. And this would have matched Boulet's other contemporaneous approaches to chapel design, including work he had done at the Invalides and the Visitation Convent of Saint-Maurice de Chaillot, which we showed earlier. Another drawing at the National Museum depicts an entry gate of a similar dating and site condition as at the convent. It shows a doorway with a semicircular tympanum framed by engaged columns in the Doric order and topped by a pediment that carries two flaming trophies and a draped figure resembling Saint Dominic, the patron of the Dominican order, represented carrying a stalk of lilies. Below the elevation, a sketched floor plan locates the gate set back from the street. These drawings possibly served as a guide for the project, noting its representation in the Turgot plan, this plan from 1635, which kind of shows a gate kind of evocative of this design, though it's unclear whether Boulet continued his involvement with the order. During the design process, sculptors would use architects' drawings to craft study models in different materials, which helped them conceptualize the composition in 3 dimensions. In the absence of Magnet's models, the ones that no longer exist, unfortunately, one might observe a parallel instance for which a drawing prompted artistic experimentation. A drawing of an altarpiece by the Royal Atelier of Robert Decotte likely served as a guide for the carved and fired study model on the right, housed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Projects such as this illustrate how designers incorporated novel and increasingly ornate decorative embellishments at the church's liturgical heart. In the drawing, the architects articulated the corners with cherub heads, a detail that is replicated on the left and right side of the model. The miniature illustrates how sculptors collapse multiple options in one form to explore different ideas to present one to one's patron. The condition on the altar's left gives way to volute topped by acanthus leaves, magnified on the image on the far left. And the right side of the furnishing terminates with a more kind of classical but equally ornate scroll, likely to be made in marble or bronze. And models such as this played a critical role in design development, given that they communicated the curvilinear forms and ornamental flourishes to patrons much more effectively than drawings or written documentations. The opposition used Boulet's drawings and Magnet's models as a testament to the quality and quantity of work completed. As part of the requested compensation, the architect requested payments for past work plus interest, which ranged from 8 to 10% at the turn of the 18th century. This elevated rate, which tallied about 3 to 5% points greater than in England, reflected the broader insecurities in the French credit market during the 9 Years' War and the War of Spanish Succession, which immediately followed, which kind of tanked the French economy, quite frankly. And as a legal matter, the opposition suggested Boulay anchored the evidentiary value of his labor and managerial expertise in the drawings that he composed and the visits and services that he completed for the project. Oh, sorry, I don't want to go there quite yet. So the decorative nature of architectural projects required the collaboration, coordination, and trust of different building professionals. More than drawings and models, written contracts delineated the roles and responsibilities of actors on site. Remarkably, Boulay himself actually warned of potential work and fee disputes in his recently published treatise, which is called the Architecture Pratique, which was published in 1691, just about 87 years prior, which presented a streamlined method to measure a project and draft legal paperwork. This move helped to formalize the architect's duties as coordinators of work and arbiters of taste in civil and commercial society. So in the absence of a notarized contract, which would have been done for construction, Boulay and Magnier enlisted de Montville's legal aid. Within the judiciary system, de Montville worked as a law clerk, which was called a law clerk and procureur, or solicitor. It looks like prosecutor, but it was a solicitor, which tended to the mechanical aspects of legal practice, things like filing motions, drafting writs, and collecting evidence. And unlike avocat or lawyers or barristers, they worked more in the procedural sphere of paperwork than the intellectual one of oral arguments. Engravers satirized the bureaucracy of legal practice, as well as the distractions that might compromise a middling town solicitor. The Foolish Complaints is the image here on the far left by the artist Abraham Bass. The Foolish Complaints of a Petulant Villageoise at the desk here. The text kind of humorous. She's there complaining to the solicitor that her husband is not like tending her garden very well. So it's humorous. The allure of the well-heeled bourgeois or urban dweller here walking into the door, and the bribes of fruit and fowl by the garçon on the right, by the two boys on the right. On the right-hand side, the absurd quantity of paperwork comprises the very outfit of the legal professional. Once reviewed, a solicitor would review and file the reports with the judge. And if conflicts could not be resolved at this initial phase, the case would be transferred to a barrister for litigation. In both prints, the sheer quantity of documents mocked the bureaucratic character of the judiciary in the 17th century. So as a member of the Royal Academy of Architecture, he showed a marked interest in the technical, legal, and bureaucratic dimensions of architectural practice, that is Boulay. In his treatise, he warned of possible labor and fee disputes. The book, which he published shortly after entering the academy, demonstrates his academic interests as well as professional orientation. As per the title, it outlines the taking of the toisé, which show here the longer title, the Architecture Pratique, which is understood by the details of the toisé, the work orders of works of masonry, carpentry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As per the title, it outlines the taking of the toisé, which was a technique of measuring materials and ornaments by the toise, or the municipal measuring rod, for contractual purposes. So the unit itself was about 6 feet long and kind of roughly corresponded to the dimension of a human being outspread. It formed an integral part of early modern building practice and helped architects, contractors, and other workers anticipate the materials and costs of construction. The treatise harnessed the science of measurement to the laws that regulated labor and construction in the capital. The book itself began with a study of practical geometry, which included formulas to calculate the surface area of geometric shapes and volumes of geometric bodies. So some of those images shown here on the right-hand side. From there, it advised on the measuring of architectural elements composed of those geometric forms, including walls, floors, vaults, pediments, and interior decoration. He included, as part of this, a sample devis, or specifications and cost estimate, which one drafted with dimensions and the going rate of different materials. Once agreed upon by all relevant parties, the document was signed, notarized, and filed at the municipal judiciary at the Grand Châtelet, which is shown here on the left-hand side. And this is the institution that actually housed the city's benchmark standard, shown by these like guys here using quite literally this kind of like measuring rod. These papers, the papers produced, this devis, could be requested to settle legal disputes regarding cost and construction. Amid an unstable labor market, Boulay aimed to fold architecture into the bureaucracies that regulated practice on the private market. Boulay argued that architects alone possessed the knowledge and skills to draft legal documentation. He writes here, quote, when one wants to make a devis, or the kind of specifications and cost estimate, when one wants to make a devis as the best form, he wrote, one must explain all the required conditions, but it is first necessary that the design of the building have been completed so that nothing in it changes. It is necessary that all the principal measurements and dimensions of the design are listed so that the devis relating to it makes no mistakes. This is why only the architect can make the design that can be used for this document, because it is he that must give the solidity and perfection to the work. That is the sentiment of the best authors who have written on architecture and the rules of good sense. He goes on to kind of claim architects as akin to authors. So as generators of design and coordinators of work, Boulay argued architects understood how details, materials, and workers came into relationship. He drew a connection between a well-articulated contract and one's ethical standing, arguing that those who wanted to succeed required the company of honest and skilled partners. It was a little surprise then that for the Mausoleum project, he worked with a kind of family that he had a long-time connection with. Now, in the Academy of Architecture, theorists continued to rehearse the debate between the liberal and mechanical arts, with a frontispiece of André Philibbien's treatise showing an allegory of artistic genius directing the unrefined labor on the left. The author here framed the issue in linguistic terms, writing, quote, there is nothing as important as in the arts as to speak well, which is necessary for the judgment of all works, as well as knowledge of what each work signifies. Measurement and drawing tools such as those on the right help the architect conceive the material world for formal purpose and kind of with a sense of clarity. Similarly, another theorist at the time, or practitioner and theorist named Augustin Charles-de-Villiers, advocated for a kind of semantic clarity in matters of decoration. One plate, shown here on the left-hand side, presented moldings with the outline and workaday names by masons on the left-hand side, the ones on outline, and rendered profiles and classical terms by architects on the right. He writes here, moldings are to architecture as what letters are to writing. Now, just as though the combination of characters and almost infinitely quantity of words in various languages may be created. This juxtaposition between the kind of way architects might conceive it and workers signaled the architect's effort to establish a system of architectural expression and coordination based on nomenclature and a kind of clarity in that nomenclature. So Boulay, kind of writing at the exact same moment as these guys, he kind of places these theoretical and practical concerns within a legal and bureaucratic framework. His treatise provided a specifications template, which included sample text mixed with notes to the reader in italics. In it, he affirmed the contractor's responsibility as well as price tabulations. And here's an extended kind of passage. And he writes, all the work in masonry, it's kind of legalese, I apologize. All the work in masonry will be well and duly made and perfect, conforming to the current devis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to all those that are experts in the field, contractor will furnish all materials of any kind whatsoever for the conditions and quality, blah, 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 blah. But you can see here, anything in italics is supposed to be a note to the reader that you don't include. Like if the work order is offered outright, one says all is done and perfect for the price and sum of blah, 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 which you would add the price in there. And gives different ways of like, it's kind of line item to order out. So this kind of standard format aimed to remove potential friction in the notarial process. So having provided all the prices of the different works, Boulay wrote immediately following the template that, quote, it is necessary to have the devis and marché recognized in front of a notary. It's like right here at the very end of this document here. So in early modern Paris, legal documents required authorization by one of the capital's 113 notaries. And the profession developed out of ancient Roman law, which prioritized written over oral contracts. And this approach, the preference of written over oral, minimized ambiguities and fraud, but presented challenges given kind of lower literacy rates. So as such, the medieval courts formalized a body of notaries to draft and register contracts under authority of the Grand Châtelet. And the figure of the notary, I'm kind of interested in all of these kind of bureaucratic actors that start to emerge and kind of play a key role as a kind of like diagnosing a kind of like emergent bureaucratic state. So here, the figure of the notary was a common refrain in period popular culture and entertainment, which kind of mocked the profession's claim to integrity and honesty. So the engraving here on the left-hand side included a so-called notaire ignorant, or ignorant notary, who approves a sham contract importing the supposed spoils of maritime trade. There must be loyalty in the market, the title reads, but he who can deceives. And to the left figures representation, falsity, and fraud, fool a would-be buyer, noting that, quote, a bad agreement is worth more than a good trial. In his comedies, Molière frequently deployed the notary as a kind of stock character to ridicule the structures of political protocol and advancement. So that's shown here on the right-hand side, and Les Femmes Savantes, published in 1672, but this image from slightly later. A mother and father employed a string of notaries to officiate each of the potential suitors for their daughter, each having a different idea of who their daughter should marry, and kind of having a kind of legal actor along with each of these guys who come into the scene. So in this and other instances, the figure kind of sheds light on the elastic and often subjective nature of truth, fairness, and honesty within the social bureaucracy of early modern France. These documents penned, the ones that Boulay showed, penned in elaborate cursive and bearing the notarized seal of the Généralité de Paris, provided the judiciary at the Grand Châtelet with authenticated evidence for conflict resolution and contract negotiations. Boulay himself, he proposes you do this. He actually did do this. I was like looking at some of his own devis, but often added even more kind of verbal clarity on what he wanted to do and his authority. So this is just an example of the masonry specification for a housing complex for the Priory of Saint-Martin-de-Champs, which is now currently the Arts et Métiers, the museum in Paris. And in it, he kind of echoes what he had written before, writing that all the work of masonry will be well and duly done and perfect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but adds in here that he himself, he wants to be able to kind of to measure it himself. Everything will be conducted, measured, and received by the aforementioned Sieur Boulay, the said toisé being done according to the customary laws and traditions of Paris. So through this kind of like legalese, Boulay aligned his authority with technical skill on the one hand, but also the codes and customs of the capital, that Coutume de Paris being the civil code for the capital and imperial realms. So by advising his readers to copy the specifications template, the architect streamlined contract documentation according to the norms and customs of the capital's judiciary. The effort kind of differed from earlier Italian precedents, I suppose, gesturing to the elephant in the room, which following Michael Baxendale varied according to the patron and his or her values and priorities for works of art. So during the 15th centuries, as Baxendale writes, he kind of discerns a shift in emphasis from the artist contract and the contracts for paintings, specifically for altarpieces. And at the beginning of the century, the documents kind of stressed material opulence, and at the end of the century, they emphasized pictorial composition. So for him, this kind of suggests an evolution in the patron's visual perception and social values. And to this end, someone like Boulay, even though it's much drier, admittedly, but he kind of prioritized standardization, verbal clarity, and reference to the customary legal code of the municipality, which for him kind of abetted the bureaucratic efficiency and approval process. So the responsibility to draft and document these documents signal the architect's authoritative standing in the eyes of the law, but also within the building trades. So the inventory of the Abbé de Fiat failed to mention the outcome of Boulay and Magnet's request, which is not surprising. Usually if things kind of get resolved out of hand, they kind of like don't get documented. So one can assume that since there was not a paper trail, this was not taken from the solicitor to a lawyer afterwards, you can assume that that they received some compensation, that there was an agreement between the estate of the abbot and the workers. So otherwise, the document itself here on the left-hand side tabulated the contents and value of the estate, which would be dispersed among the abbot's inheritors. Boulet's interest in contract documentation and the specifications were symptomatic of broader efforts on behalf of the state and municipality to formalize professional practice and standardize labor and tastes. The process coincided with broader debates and moral and political philosophy that interrogated the relationships that structured civil and moral society. In this regard, the ability to draft legally binding documents signaled the development of the trade into a professional enterprise. The effort to establish the social and vocational distinctions between architects, masons, and contractors remained a leitmotif of architectural theory and labor during the 18th century. As the debate played out, drawing and draftsmanship helped to establish the scope and limits of authority in matters of design, invention, and building practice. The 18th century gave rise to the very first manuals on drawing practice, kind of aimed for a wider audience, in France, I should say, signaling the importance of these documents for establishing authority and conveying information to varying members of the building industries. At the end of the century, one writer argued that, quote, "It is he who makes the drawing is the one who orders building activities." The architectural trade's rhetorical alignment with art, quote unquote, helps to explain the pen, black ink, and wash drawing by the visionary architect Jean-Jacques Lecoeur, kind of paper architect, one might call him, that shows a disembodied hand instructing on the means and methods of drawing composition, shadow composition, and so on. The architect's compensation came to rely less on construction as the period went on, and more actually on the number of site visits conducted. So this kind of ambiguity within the field is being resolved to some degree within the kind of legal framework, although maybe not clarified in any definitive way. To its end, Boulet's Architecture Pratique, that kind of treatise, remained popular among the learned and everyday workers, being republished a remarkable 20 times during the course of the 18th century. So the debacle that unfolded at the Arsenal illustrates two parallel operations in architectural practice at the turn of the 18th century in France. On the one hand, the act of drafting, notarizing, and filing legally binding documents announced one's authority within the building industries. Boulet's effort to standardize the form and language of the devise signaled the field shift away from the kind of apprentice model of craft practice and embodied knowledge and toward a more bureaucratic enterprise whose efficient operations relied on paperwork and the norms of standards of legal protocol. Within this framework, drawings and modeled functions as forms of evidence to support the quality and quantity of work completed. On the other hand, the very nature of the commission illustrates the wider commercialization of architectural practice during the early modern period. Work stoppages within the state building works prompted many architects to seek work with private clients, and ecclesiastical bodies provided unique opportunities given the visibility of the work, their relationship to social standing, and perhaps most importantly, their vast real estate holdings in a rapidly developing capital. So the early modern preoccupation with the building standards and the processes of standardization more generally betrayed not a proto-industrial spirit, but instead a desire to set norms for a profession and public that were only then coming into their modern formation. To his end, Boulet aimed to streamline the drafting and filing of contract documents according to the norms and customs of the municipal bureaucracy. I suppose the very fact that they're kind of boring is the point. The emphasis placed on paperwork illustrates the degree to which professional practice relied as much on clarity and procedural completeness as strict vocational training. In this regard, one might conceive architectural expertise not as a binary between artisanal skill, say the body of the artisan, or theoretical aptitude, but rather as a kind of rhetorical and juridical designation, one whose definition hinged on the legal customs and commercial maneuverings that marked the processes of professionalization in the last decade of the 17th century. Thank you.